The opening shot of the new title sequence is reminiscent of and parallels the Season 1 intro as we see Mark sitting down on a bed, a sliver of light illuminating a portion of the room. Though his outfit here is similar to the one he wore in the Season 1 intro, there's a distinct difference which I find fascinating, and that's the fact that the red pajamas are actually now a onesie. The Season 1 intro did feature Mark wearing red pajamas, but they were separate pieces, whereas now they're connected. This could obviously just be a stylistic choice with no actual meaning behind it, but were I to extrapolate meaning, I'd think that this is used largely to conjure and channel the image of infancy, which we see repeated throughout the rest of this title sequence. A onesie is a very infantilizing garment, usually only seen on young children. It's also a stifling, suffocating garment which affords the inhabitant less freedom of movement and overall autonomy. It could also potentially represent a union of sorts, as we see his outfit go from two separate pieces to one holistic piece. This is another concept that's prevalent throughout the sequence. The next shot seems to combine both his home and the Lumen building as we see the Lumen elevator, but also the shadow of blinds. Lumen, especially the severed floor, doesn't ever really include windows and certainly not blinds. The place where we have seen this before is Mark's house, so this is likely a merging of the two worlds. Mark gets up to face the elevator, and as he does, his shadow comes into frame. The long, looming figure projected is reminiscent of the Season 1 imagery of shadows made of black goo. The elevator opens and a balloon head version of Mark makes its way outward, his tie cleverly replacing a string as a means of wrangling and transportation. Balloons have been a recurrent motif throughout the show and have been highlighted particularly in Season 2. I can't help but notice that the expression on the balloon Mark is decidedly negative and clearly unhappy. This, directly juxtaposed to the shot of Mark descending the depths to investigate, reminds me of the idea that any Mark was a whistleblower to alert Outie Mark to the fact that he was unhappy. This scene of Mark descending the staircase is framed through brain matter. This feels like a direct reference to the shot we received in Season 1 of Cobell looking through Petey's head after removing the implant. Once Mark descends the stairs, perhaps symbolic of descending to the severed floor, he sees multiple balloon head versions of himself floating aimlessly. Mark is using the brain as a surface to walk upon, and in his reflection we see Helly running one way and Miss Casey running the other. Perhaps this is foreshadowing him being torn and pulled in two different directions. Next we see miniature Mark standing on his own chin and coming face to face with what is presumably his innie as he's dressed in work attire. His innie is also holding a flashlight, seemingly investigating, and they are stunned to turn around and meet face to face. The symbolic potential here is potent. It could represent looking at yourself in the mirror and doing introspection, both versions of himself literally or figuratively coming to terms with the other, or even reintegration, among many other things. It's also interesting to note a slight difference from the Season 1 intro, which is that in the version of Mark in work attire here, he also still has a Lumen badge around his neck, which he notably did not in the Season 1 intro. The next shot zooms out to find all of this taking place on top of a sleeping Mark in bed. He seems shocked to see this unfold in front of him and quickly goes to grab the two smaller versions of himself, seemingly to conceal them. This might indicate some sort of heightened awareness about the surveillance and danger surrounding the situation. Littered around him are a slew of faceless infants dressed in professional attire. They all seem to be in various states of waking up and coming into consciousness, and I think this is likely a reference to the severed versions of people essentially being babies. Any Mark is, logistically and for all intents and purposes, only 2 years old. Everything is foreign and new to them. They're essentially starting from scratch and begin their severed existence similarly to infants. I also can't help but wonder if this has anything to do with the introduction of Miss Huang, because as they have stated so thoroughly, she's a child, and it's beyond strange to see a literal child on this floor, in this environment. Her history and background is still unclear, but the possibility of people potentially being born, bred, and raised within the confines of Lumen is something that's been introduced by her presence. Though this is less likely, it's also possible this might foreshadow a future pregnancy or birth. In Season 1, we saw people using Severance specifically and only to give birth. There was a reference to a severed woman who got pregnant, and in this season, we see the introduction of quote-unquote sexual liberation being offered to the innies, and what seems to be Helly and Mark becoming intimate. The implications and complications of a pregnancy acquired while severed are obviously concerning. As they zoom out even further, it seems that the central image is being reflected back from multiple different directions, though the images have something of a Gaussian blur. This then transitions to a shot of the implant making its way through Mark's brain, the red Mark trapped inside the implant itself. The suited version of Mark is attempting to pull the implant out of his head, potentially hinting at a future desire to reintegrate. As they transition to the next shot, you can very briefly see wires attached to Mark's head, which is very reminiscent of this shot from a promotional clip for Season 2. Again, this image invokes the process of reintegration. Mark falls into a coffee mug with Irving's face on it, the handle fashioned into the shape of a bee. This is reminiscent of the Season 1 intro shot, but the inclusion and centering of Irving is intriguing. Instead of multiple marks spilling out of the cup, we see multiple white miniature brass instruments spilling out. I'm unclear as to what this might be referencing, so if you have any ideas, please comment them below. We pull out yet again to see Mark's visage being reflected back to him, though the surface is scratched and the image is obscured. His face is blurred similarly to how we recently saw the babies' faces as well. I wouldn't be surprised if this is somehow connected to the quote-unquote mirror room that was mentioned in Season 2, Episode 1 either. They reprised this shot of Mark diving feet first into his own mind, back to work, but very quickly the aesthetic shifts both in style and substance as it transforms into painted portraits of goats. Goats are obviously an important element in the show, and if the previews are any indication, we'll likely see this expanded upon in the rest of the season. This zooms outward to see Mark grabbing toward the back of his head, potentially a gesture indicating pain. This again seems to be indicative of reintegration, as we saw Petey make motions like this many times and have seen Mark do the same in the Season 2 trailer. It appears as though the image of the goat is actually being projected onto a screen that Mark is looking at, similar to the screen we saw in Episode 1 of Season 2. There are two identical male figures holding up the screen on either side, and this may be a stretch, but I think it's possible this is supposed to represent Milchick. It's difficult to tell, but I do think that the figures are shown to have a bit of a darker skin tone than Mark or any of the other versions of characters we see in this intro. It also looks like he may be wearing a turtleneck and potentially a leather jacket, both of which we see Milchick wear. Regardless, these obscure figures are holding up this image and observing as Mark watches. Suddenly, it's clear that we're outdoors as we see snow falling, a glacial atmosphere, what looks to be icebergs floating, and multiple trees in the background. While back to back, both versions of Mark bump into each other, and as a result, the suited version of Mark's head inflates into a balloon and begins to fly away, detaching from the rest of his body as it slumps and sinks underwater. This could represent the idea that both cannot exist simultaneously, that disruption on one side will affect the other, or generally just point out a separation of mind and body, a bifurcation and severance of different parts. We see this exact scenario reflected on surrounding icebergs, being initiated at different times, staggered almost like the Ennies entrances. Mark jumps up to hold on to his balloon self, either trying to keep hold of it or bring it back to the ground. Ironically, in trying to ground himself, the balloon guarantees that he floats away instead, potentially calling into question who really has the control in this situation. In the background here, we also see a car partially submerged into ice-cold water, and this is likely a reference to the car crash which took the life of Mark's wife. We've seen that the site of the crash, and the tree in particular, is important to Mark as he revisits it and even subconsciously sculpts it while on the severed floor. This is more evidence that these two versions of the self are inextricably linked and intertwined. One affects the other, it's symbiotic. Mark floats toward the silhouette of a brain where his head is partially submerged. As the balloon enters his head, the environment changes to Mark sitting face down at a table. He's surrounded by pills strewn about the surface, and as his head inflates, he knocks over a small bottle of indiscriminate liquid. While the inflation of the heads and the balloon metaphor are representative of a lot of complex emotional themes, it also does bring to mind the line from Milchick in Episode 1 about inflated egos and things going to his head. If you look closely at the bottle that spills, it actually contains another tiny version of Mark, seemingly the suit-attired one. Yet another image of a small, powerless Mark trapped inside an enclosure. As he backs away, the appearance of a photo or perhaps a piece of paper becomes clear. I'm guessing, based on the texture, this might be the picture we saw Mark tear up of Gemma in Season 1, the one used to give the audience the big reveal of Mark's wife and Miss Casey being one and the same. Mark, obviously upset, assumes a childlike mien, stomping backward as a kid would in a temper tantrum, perhaps another reference to infantilization. Behind him, suited Mark is lifting up the doorway for him to pass through. I find it very notable that the surface used to represent this is a curtain-like fabric. It could be coincidence, but it seems fortuitous in the least that this is quite literally Mark lifting the curtain. On the other side, we see another suited version of Mark, except this time without his coat on. This feels like a reference to entering and exiting the severed floor, as the times we see Mark without his suit jacket are times when he is firmly entrenched in his workday on the severed floor. Yet again, like a baby, he carries him over to the other side. This intro does have an overwhelming sense of Mark helping or rescuing himself through this. Different Marks, different versions or sides of him, both investigating and collaborating to save him. This environment quickly transforms into an area of greenery, and in the promotional material, the visual imagery of the elevator door leading to the outside world is seen a lot and speaks volumes. They pan out to show a parallel yet opposite image reflected on the other side, as we see Mark in the onesie carrying Mark in the suit outside the elevator door. On one side, we see other versions of the suited Mark crawling around, and on the other, parallel images of the Mark in the onesie doing the same. The left side includes inflated balloon heads of Heli rolling around aimlessly, while the right includes inflated balloon versions of what looks to be Miss Casey doing the same. As we pull out, the surface this is taking place on is revealed to be a book, one that Cobell is observing intensely. The zoom in on Cobell's face sees Mark in the onesie, flashlight in hand, seemingly in a lumen hallway, looking startled. He quickly turns around and begins to run away. This then morphs into the hallway of the testing floor we've seen Miss Casey in and Irving's drawings of. Inside the elevator, we see Heli and Miss Casey flash and flicker back and forth in place of one another. Yet again, this could be a reference to Reintegration, as we've seen similar shots in various promotion. Generally, it's also representative of the disorienting, confusing nature of Severance itself, as well as the emotional, moral, and ethical dilemmas that come as a result of them, not the least of which is the complication between the love any Mark has for Heli and the love outie Mark has for Gemma, and how the two conflict with each other. We return to the opening image of Mark on the bed, now with more snow inhabiting the room. Again, this sliver of light indicates an open door. The weather in the show is almost always snowy and icy, so this makes logical sense, but metaphorically, this shows elements of one world seeping into the other so long as there's a crack in the door. Confused and seemingly disoriented, Mark looks around and comes across an infant version of Kier crawling at his feet. As Kier turns his head, the accumulation of snow drops downward, a subtle beat of bizarre comedy that is a signature of Severance. The last shot we see is the back of Mark's head as he shakes it back and forth, scored to the glitch sound effect. His scalp is opened up by hands prying their way out, and lastly, we see Mark trying desperately to escape and be free, his gaze directly to camera. Even though I feel like I picked up on a lot here, I'm sure there are still things that I missed or didn't notice or misinterpreted, so let me know your thoughts down below. Do you prefer this intro to the first one? What did you notice? What are your opinions, theories, speculation concerning what this means for the series as a whole? And I will see you for another video soon.